Today, I'm going to give you my thoughts about whether UX design bootcamps are worth it or not. I went to General Assembly back in 2018 for their UX design immersive program. So now that I've been in the field for more than 4 years, I have a lot to say on this topic. Throughout this video, I'm going to be using some terms that you might not be familiar with if you're just starting to look into UX. So I'm going to leave a glossary down below in the description that explains some of these terms. If I miss some, please leave a comment below and I'll reply with the definition of that term. I'll give you the short answer, the long answer, and tell you a bit about what it was like after I graduated from the bootcamp. The short answer is, I would say it is mostly worth it if you manage your expectations for what you're going to get out of that bootcamp and you have the money to spend on the bootcamp. And here's the longer answer. I would say that UX bootcamps are a fantastic way of learning a lot about UX in a short amount of time, as well as getting a good starter portfolio together. For General Assembly and many of the other good boot camps out there, they're going to find real businesses that need UX work done and have you do a project for them. This is a fantastic way of getting some real-world experience under your belt before you go out into the job market. The quality of instruction, at least for my boot camp, was fantastic. I had 2 instructors who had years of experience working at top tech companies. It's also a good way to instantly have a network of people who are doing the same thing as you. It isn't the easiest thing in the world to make a career switch like this, so it's great to have people there who are by your side and are happy to help you out. With all of the great things that boot camps have to offer, I think it's also important to manage your expectations for what you can get out of it. So from what I've seen, many of the designers coming out of boot camps will have a good base of knowledge about design, but they won't quite be at the point where they can get attention from some of the top companies out there, excel in an interview process, and get a job with them. Many of the designers coming out of boot camps still do get jobs, but it tends to be with smaller, less established startups. Most designers post boot camp tend to have some pretty big gaps in their knowledge that make it pretty difficult to get a job. I'll go through what some of these gaps are, and I'll start with the most important one. For most people, UI and visual design skills are going to be lacking after a bootcamp. So most bootcamps out there are going to be focusing less on these skills and more on a general UX process that really focuses on research. It's completely understandable because these bootcamps advertise themselves as UX bootcamps and not UI bootcamps. But the problem is that most junior designers in their first role are going to be doing a lot of UI design. And this is actually the reason that many companies will hire that new designer. It's less common that these companies are going to be hiring a junior designer to be making big, important UX decisions that significantly impact the company. From what I've seen, designers in their first jobs will normally be given instructions and specs for what a design should be like, and that designer is going to be making wireframes and mock-ups based on the instructions that they received, which means UI design skills are going to be one of the most important things that would make them succeed in that kind of design process. This might not be the best way to design, but it's very common that companies do this. When an experienced designer looks at a new grad's portfolio, it's almost always clear that the UI skills are lacking in it. And a lot of the work in that portfolio does not look like something that can go in a real-world product and be shipped to customers. There are absolutely roles out there where strong UI skills are not required, and that company is going to have a separate UI designer and a separate UX designer. But mostly it's going to be larger companies that are hiring for roles like this. And larger companies are usually not going to be hiring someone who's brand new to design. So that leaves newer startups who are mostly going to be the ones who are willing to hire new designers. And from what I've seen, companies like this are almost always going to want that designer to do UI and UX work. And that UI work is going to be extremely important to them because having a good UI makes that product easier to sell and makes people take their product more seriously. So if a designer can only provide UX work, not UI work, it's going to be far less likely that they get hired by a company like this. Another gap that I've noticed is that most designers post-bootcamp are going to be tied to a very rigid UX process. The reason for this is that most bootcamps out there are going to teach what I would say is the ideal UX process. And that consists of some key components like doing user research interviews, whiteboarding a solution, making user personas, making low fidelity wireframes, high fidelity mockups, things like this. While this is a fantastic way of doing UX, most companies out there are not going to have the time or the resources to do a process like this. So many designers are going to be going into their interviews and the jobs afterwards expecting that this is the way that the companies want UX to be done. And it creates a little bit of friction with these companies. In the interviews, they're not going to really be able to speak the same language as the person that they're talking to because both people have kind of different expectations for how they see that design work being done. Many companies out there, especially startups, are going to be focused more on designing and building new features quickly so that they can get them in the hands of their users and start learning. It's a little bit different than the longer UX process that we learn that can really slow down the time from having a new idea about a design to actually shipping it. And the third gap in knowledge that bootcamp designers tend to have is that they often don't develop a good skill set with some of the most common design tools that are used out there. So in the industry today, most designers are going to be using a tool called Figma for their designs. And it's going to be extremely important for a newer designer to be able to do things like organize files properly, make reusable components, and do some of the more advanced actions in Figma or whatever design tool that they're using. So this can really slow down a designer in their first job if they have to learn as they go. And it can also hurt them in the interview process if that interviewer figures out that they don't know how to use those tools very well. So even though these knowledge gaps do tend to exist, they can absolutely be overcome. The UI and the visual design skills can be learned outside of the bootcamp. Designers can do their own research about what it's usually like working at a company and what they can expect when they're interviewing with someone or in their first job. And then of course, the Figma skills or other design tool skills can be learned through things like online courses. So if somebody does a whole bootcamp and spends a lot of time doing outside learning, they can absolutely be set up to get a great job shortly after graduating from that bootcamp. So now I'll tell you what my experience was like after graduating from my bootcamp. So shortly after I graduated, my plan was to try to get a full-time job. And I applied to about 200 jobs. And I got something like one interview where I didn't make it past the first round. Looking back, I knew exactly what the problem was. My portfolio just screamed new designer. UI skills were not strong. The case studies that I had followed the rigid UX process that I was discussing earlier. And the case studies looked just like every other bootcamp grad out there who was following a pretty similar formula with their case studies. Since I was not getting a lot of attention on the job market, I ended up pursuing freelance design instead. So I started by doing some shorter term projects at a low rate for startups that were on a pretty serious budget. And so I used these projects to improve my design skills, improve my ability to communicate the designs that I was working on, and really becoming a true design professional. And so with those projects, I ended up making a portfolio of the work I did, and I was able to discuss the real world business results that I got for those companies. After freelancing for about 2 years and accumulating that portfolio of work, I was able to get my first full-time job as a product designer at Citibank. A product designer is basically the same thing as a UX designer. So I've been working at Citibank right up until now. So even though I didn't land that full-time job right out of bootcamp, that doesn't mean that this is the experience that everyone has. I do know of many people that did get a full-time job right out of a bootcamp. Like I was saying before, it tended to be at these smaller startups, but every once in a while there is a bootcamp graduate that gets a job at some of the top tech companies out there. I'm personally very happy that I went to the bootcamp. It absolutely set me on the right path with my career and really made design work out for me. It changed me from being someone who was just interested in design to really becoming a true UX designer, and really made me pursue this career with all that I had. I still believe that it's possible to become a self-taught UX designer, but I think if you have the money to spend on a bootcamp like this, it can absolutely be a good idea. So thank you for watching, and if you have any questions about bootcamps or any other design topics, please leave a comment below.